Good evening, everybody. We'll get you all into our Zoom room and get settled. And while you do, you can see the poll that I've put up that's blocking this beautiful picture of Wave Hill. My name is Ann Thompson. I'm the Assistant Director for Public Services here at the Essex Library. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our Nature into Art author talk with Thomas Christopher tonight. Let me cover just a couple of things for housekeeping reasons. You can see the poll up there. I am required by the Connecticut State Library to report attendance at our programming. And so I would really be pleased and grateful if you would respond to the poll with how many people are viewing your screen with you. That allows me to count the heads very conveniently. And thank you in advance for helping me with that task. We can get on with the other more important things. Tonight, as you think of questions, please go ahead and post them in the chat, and I will holler them out to Tom after his presentation. We have a very large crowd tonight, so we're going to keep you hopefully with your microphones muted and your cameras off to preserve the bandwidth. If you have a question but you're not comfortable writing it into the chat, if you know how to raise your digital hand, please do that, and we will get to your questions at the end of Tom's presentation. I'm hoping to be able to take every single one. And with that, let me introduce Tom Christopher. I think we have most of the polling in, but I'll let it stay up while I introduce Tom. Thomas Christopher is a graduate of the New York Botanical Garden School of Professional Horticulture. He has worked as a columnist for Horticulture, House and Garden, Country Living Gardener, and he's a contributing editor at Martha Stewart Living and a contributor to the New York Times and the Journal of Royal Horticulture Society. He is the author or co-author of more than a dozen books and hosts the weekly Growing Greener podcast sponsored by the Berkshire Botanical Garden. I'm honored to welcome Tom Christopher to the Essex Library Zoom stage, and tonight he's going to be talking about this amazing book. He's going to give you details, but there is a lot to go through with this book. It's a lovely book. The photographs are beautiful, and it is really a step-by-step, in some ways, how to grow plants in almost any kind of garden that you could replicate in Connecticut if you had the space. So thank you for answering the poll. We're going to stop that. And Tom, I am very pleased to welcome you. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, I've got the poll still on my screen. Is that a problem or?
Sorry, I think you can click out of it. It's down.
Okay. Share results or?
No.
Let's see, I'm having a little difficulty here. There's relaunch or share results.
But Tom, we're not seeing it when you're on the screen for the participant, so I think we're okay.
Okay, very good.
And my last little piece of my introduction is to just note that Rita Christopher, who is a previous chair of our board at the Essex Library, is Tom's stepmother, and she's here in the program tonight. So welcome, Rita.
Yes, much beloved stepmother, I have to add, because stepmothers get a bad rap. But anyway, I'm going to talk to you. I'm going to take you on a trip tonight. I think we're all ready for a trip at this point. We've all been locked up and we're ready to go out and go somewhere exotic. And there's no place more exotic than the Bronx in my experience. And I'm going to take you down to the Bronx and to a wonderful public garden called Wave Hill. That's the subject of my book, Nature into Art, is all the lessons. It's Wave Hill, the gardens at Wave Hill, and all the lessons you can learn from them. But I want to start first by talking about my own relationship with that garden, because it's a long one and it's been very influential in my development as a gardener. I was first introduced to Wave Hill in 1977. I was a student of the New York Botanical Garden then, and I was so poor at the time, as many students are, that I couldn't go out in the evening. I didn't have, if I was very careful all week, I'd have enough money for one pitcher of beer at the neighborhood tavern in the Bronx where I was living in a 5th floor walk-up. But what it inadvertently turned out to be a very good thing, because what happened, um, are you getting some feedback? I'm sorry. Um, anyway,
We're getting a bit of a echo.
should I take off my, maybe I'll
Yeah,
take off my headset?
I think that might help.
All right, let me do this. I'm sorry about the glitch. All right. Anyway, to go back to what I was talking about, I was a student at the New York Botanical Garden, and inadvertently being broke was a very good thing, because in those days, as a student, the head librarian took pity on me, and he gave me a key to the library, this magnificent library, the best horticultural and botanical library in the world. And he said so that I could come in and spend my evenings in the library, which is exactly what I did. I'd go in at about after supper, I'd go down to the library, let myself in, and just start reading books. I just go down the stacks in the library reading books. I love libraries, and this was a great experience. It was a wonderful education all in and of itself. But around about 11 o'clock, 11:30, I'd get tired and I'd quit, and I'd go upstairs to where T.H. Everett and Miss Hall were, in Mr. Everett's office. T.H. was he was the retired head of horticulture from the New York Botanical Garden, a great English horticulturist. And Miss Hall was the retired head librarian. And they were working, they came in every night to work on a 10-volume encyclopedia of gardening. They were co-writing. And so I would come in, and Mr. Everett would tell Miss Hall to get out the beer, and we'd sit and drink beers together, and he would tease Miss Hall. Miss Hall would ignore him, and they would both tell me stories about their days at the New York Botanical Garden, and also tell me what I should be learning about horticulture to educate myself properly. One thing they were completely agreed upon is that I had to get to Wave Hill and meet Marco Stufano. Well, who is Marco Stufano? Well, he was the founding director of horticulture at Wave Hill, which I'll get to that story, the history of Wave Hill, in just a moment. But I was interested in Marco because he'd followed a career path not unlike my own. He was about 10 years older, but he had gone to Brown University as an undergraduate, which I had done. He'd taken an arts degree there, which is what I'd done. And then he'd gone through a sort of more roundabout path. He'd gone to become a student at the New York Botanical Garden School of Horticulture. And he became a protege of T.H. Everett and Miss Hall. And when he graduated, they recommended him to be the founding director of horticulture at this brand new public garden in the Bronx, Wave Hill. Well, what is Wave Hill? I will show you, I will start showing you, this is a picture, of course, of Wave Hill. It's an amazing place. It's the last country estate left intact in New York City, and it's on the banks of the Hudson with this sweeping panoramic view. And let's see. It dates back to, Marco was the first director of horticulture. The estate itself dates back to the 1840s. This is Wave Hill House, the estate house, which was built in 1843. And of course, this was when the Bronx was still the rural hinterlands of New York City. And this is, it had a number of very famous inhabitants over the years. Wave Hill was rented out as a summer resort. Let's see, Teddy Roosevelt spent a couple of his childhood summers in Wave Hill, trying to escape. He was asthmatic, trying to escape the smoky air of Manhattan. He went up to the rural Bronx with his family. Mark Twain spent 2 years there. Arturo Toscanini lived at Wave Hill for a while. And the estate had flourished through the 19th century, but it got only bigger in around the turn of the 20th century, when this gentleman, George Perkins, put together a bunch of neighboring properties and compounded an area of 28 acres into a single estate.
Wave Hill was, it's Marco Stufano. The Perkins family owned Wave Hill until 1960, at which point it was no longer practical as a country resort, and they had places. It was, of course, it was in the Bronx. But it is amazing. It's amazing to go there even today, because what you do is you go through this gate, you go through a built-up area of the Bronx, and you go through this gate, and all of a sudden you're in a rural setting again, with this sweeping views of, as I said, the Hudson River and the Hudson River Palisades across the river. The estate was lay vacant after the Perkins were going to develop the property, and the neighborhood got together and came to them and said, can't you please keep it intact? At which point, God bless them, they donated it to New York City to become a public garden. And it lay vacant for a number of years, the grounds kind of deteriorating. And then in 1967, Marco Stufano was actually, his full name is, and this is a wonderful name, Marco Polo Stufano, was appointed the first director of horticulture. And he undertook to make it one of the great gardens of the world, which, given that the location was perhaps appropriate, but everything else was, I think he struck a lot of people at the time as a dreamer. Anyway, what he set out to accomplish was unprecedented in American gardening. And to be honest, I went there in 1977 at Mr. Everett and Miss Hall's insistence. And I don't remember an awful lot about my first visit to Wave Hill. I remember that Marco was very kind to me. I vaguely remember that I was blown away by the gardens, even back then in the early days of Wave Hill when they were just starting out. I have no real memory of John Nally, who I should have remembered. He was Marco's partner and his assistant in developing the gardens at Wave Hill. They had shared an interesting background in that both were students of the arts. Marco had studied the history of 19th century architecture at Brown, and John Nally was a printmaker before he became a gardener and joined Marco at Wave Hill. So they had this different artist's eye on the gardens. Anyway, to return, all of this explains why I was so excited when by the gardens at Wave Hill. It became a place that I returned to. I lived in the suburbs of New York for the next decade, so I could visit repeatedly and watch the gardens multiply and mature on the landscape. 28 acres of landscape right in the middle of New York City. And it became my go-to place when I wanted to take out-of-town gardeners and impress them. I'd take them up to Wave Hill, particularly if they were European, because they couldn't believe that anything like this existed in the United States. And all of this explains why I was really excited when Andrew Beckman, the publisher at Timber Press, called me up one day and asked me if I'd like to write a book about Wave Hill, about the lessons that could be learned at Wave Hill. And of course I said yes. And writing the book was every bit as fun as I anticipated, and educational too, because it involved, for about a year, a whole growing season. Every 10 days or so, I went down to Wave Hill and interviewed the gardeners about what they were doing, talked to Marco Stufano at length, and John Nally sadly died young. But Marco was very kind in sharing with me. And I also got a lot of help from the current director. Marco had retired as director of Wave Hill. The current director, who is Louis Bauer, who's as equally brilliant a gardener. He trained at Wave Hill and has taken over and is taking it to new heights. And Louis is very generous and very personable, very quotable. He's quoted at length and throughout the book, and he helped me too. So anyway, to get back to George Perkins and the history of Wave Hill, I wanted to quote for you something that Mark Twain said about the estate, which he said, "I believe we have the noblest roaring blast here I have ever known on land. They sing their hoarse song through the big treetops with a splendid energy that thrills me and stirs me and uplifts me and makes me want to live always. Well, keep this in mind as you look at the gardens of Wave Hill, because it is a very special microclimate. It's set on a hill over the Hudson River. The winds come down, up and down the river valley, and they tend to keep Wave Hill. The nearness of the water moderates the temperatures. So it stays warmer in the winter, somewhat cooler in the summer, and the intense summer humidity is blown out by the winds. So they can grow things at Wave Hill that we couldn't grow at the New York Botanical Garden, even a couple of miles away. So anyway, as I said, Marco had ambitions. He began traveling around the world. This is Marco on the left and John Nally on the right at Wakehurst Place, a famous garden that that's an outpost of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. And they went all through England, through France and Italy, looking at gardens, taking notes about what they were going to do in the Bronx. People laughed at them, incidentally, at the time. They didn't think that American gardens could be as sophisticated and as beautiful as the English gardens or the European gardens. Marco and John were determined to prove them wrong. Remember, I talked about Marco having studied architecture. Well, one of the interesting things about Wave Hill is that the architectural qualities of plant, its form, is really the basis on which the plants are chosen and placed. Even before flower color or foliage texture, it's the architecture of the plant that determines the placement and the arrangement. And here we have, I think you can see it, it's a weeping blue cedar, Cetrus atlantica glauca, pendula, spilling down off of an arbor. And underneath it, you've got purple fennel on the left, and on the right, ornamental onions and camasias, alliums and camasias. So you can see how important form is to filling the gardens at Wave Hill. That's one of the first lessons I learned walking around with the gardeners, was that there are things that we all select our plants on flower color, by flowers and flower color as gardeners, but there are other ways to go, and there are even more important qualities. This is a view of the flower garden at Wave Hill, which was built in response to John Nally and Marco Stefano being told, when they came back and talked about what they'd seen in England, yes, that's very nice, but we can't do that here. They were determined they were going to do something just as beautiful as the English mixed borders in the Bronx. And what they did was they replaced an old rose garden, a sort of threadbare survivor of the estate, and put in a symphony of perennials and a complex of beds with different textures, different colors, harmonies, and different color contrasts. Here's a view of the flower garden. You can see this collection, this marvelous interplay of the plants there. A few of the roses that left there's an old rose called Dorothy Perkins, growing up over a bench. On the right, Clematis integrifolia. This is a view in the last week of June. One thing, of course, they do is they want the garden to look good all through the growing season. It's easy, as the gardeners of Wave Hill and Louis Bauer told me, it's easy to have a garden look good in late spring, early summer, but to keep it all through the growing season good all the time, which is their goal as a public garden, always to serve the public with a beautiful display, is not easy. It takes real skill to do that. Here we have the last week of June, and you can see iris at the left in the foreground, dianthus to the right of that, and then the last peonies in the back of the garden. This is mid-August, and the garden is full of color. One thing they do is they've said that in Wave Hill, visitorship flags a little bit in the heat and humidity of midsummer, and many of their visitors wait and come back in early fall when the weather cools and the kids are back in school and they've got a chance to really enjoy the gardens again, walking around in the gardens again. One thing they do at Wave Hill, which is interesting, is they do a lot with dahlias. which are planted as tubers. And typically they're planted in late spring, but they postpone planting a lot of their dahlias until late June. And they come up, and the dahlias will come up, and they start blooming later in the season as a result of that, so that they bloom from late summer right through into fall, and they have a great fall display. Here's mid-October. I love this shot. It's the light slanting down the sun is lower in the sky. The sun, it backlights the ornamental grasses there and comes through the garden. I think the flower garden is possibly most beautiful in the fall. Excuse me, I'm having a little bit of trouble with. I wanted to get into some of the things that they've done in specific beds. Remember I said they divided it up into beds, and each bed has a theme. This is the red bed. So it's red foliages and red purple and red flowers. Here you've got dahlias, a dahlia called Bednal Beauty in the front, Sanguis sorba officinalis, the salvia, royal bumble, and they use a lot of shrubs and trees in this flower garden, which they pollard. They cut them back down close to the ground every fall. So in the spring, they send up shoots and they get the benefit of the foliage, the colorful foliage. You can see on the left there, Cotinus, royal purple, sending its foliage to hang over and serve as a backdrop for the red flowers. This is a detail of the same garden. Wonderful contrasts and a lot of harmonies, a lot of colors that are closely related, displaying each other and reinforcing each other. Here's another color harmony. It's an opium poppy on the left, Papaver somniferum, Lauren's grape, and on the right, another old rose called Veilchenblau, a German rose. As I said, color harmonies are something to think about in the rose garden, in the flower garden. It's Dahlia Daydreamer on the left and a Cape Fuchsia, Phygelia capensis on the right, which isn't supposed to be hardy in New York City, but they found that the roots overwinter successfully in Wave Hill's microclimate, and it comes back from the ground every spring. A Martagon lily at the left, and another dahlia at the right. But not all the colors are harmonies. Some of them are contrasts. Marco has a saying that he likes to include what he calls Barbra Streisand combinations. These are combinations that maybe set your teeth on edge at first, but then you come to admire them for their gussiness. And there's definitely a Barbra Streisand here on the left, where there's a dahlia, an orange dahlia, and a purple salvia, a purple sage, Salvia guaranitica amistad, and Salvia Waverly. This is in late summer when the dahlias are coming into full bloom. I thought we'd move on from the flower garden and go to the aquatic garden, which is built on the remains of an old lily pond, around the remains of an old lily pond from the estate days. But you can see this is in December. There's a wonderful kind of geometry, an orderly geometry, a kind of calm and serenity to this garden at that time, and with the mist keeping it quite beautiful. In the back, there's remember I said architecture. Well, you can choose plants not only for their intrinsic architecture, but also turn them into architecture. That's a hornbeam hedge, a European hornbeam hedge, carefully clipped to provide a backdrop for this garden. But it isn't just orderly geometry. This is in midsummer. They fill the pool full of, in late June when the water warms up, they fill it full of tropical water lilies and tropical water plants. And you get this wonderful lush kind of tumult, as you see on the left there. On the right is a tropical water lily. There you've got again in the aquatic garden, you've got a lotus, and on the right, pickerel weed. The foliage of these tropical plants is as good as the flowers. Again, form, not just flower, but form. One thing they do, which is very clever at Wave Hill, they have a big conservatory, which I'm not going to talk about tonight, but they, a lot of the plants from the conservatory come out to summer over in the garden, in various parts of the garden, and do duty almost as sculptural elements. On the left, you've got staged up on the top of the water, a pot full of pitcher plants, Sarracenias, which are bog plants. So the water wicks up through the pot and into the mossy growing medium for these pitcher plants. On the right, you've got a plant that's actually a desert plant, a Dazzlerion. It's staged up higher, so it stays above the water. But again, it works as a wonderful kind of sculptural element in the garden. And the motto of Wave Hill could be waste no opportunity. I love this. This is right beside the aquatic garden. There's an arbor, a long arbor, a sort of pergola, and they use it to display different types of climbers. Here's one summer when it was loofah gourds and bottle gourds. Very dramatic hanging down. There was another, oh goodness, another thing that the gardeners had to put up with, listening from visitors who would say, yes, this is very beautiful, but I couldn't do anything like this at home because I don't have enough sun. So they decided, all right, we'll put in a shade border that'll just knock their socks off, which is what they did underneath a series of an elm and a series of oak trees at the northern end of the gardens. This is the shade, they call it the shade border. And it's most beautiful in early spring when all the spring ephemerals come out. Here you've got Siberian bugloss on the left, and Brunnera macrophylla with Epimedium sulphureum. You can see the sort of chartreuse leaves below it. And then on the right, an anemone, a wood anemone, Anemone nemorosa. More epimediums here. The shade border is largely a springtime border, but not, it's got a lot of trilliums, beautiful collection of trilliums. There's Trillium grandiflorum at the left and Trillium sessile at the right. By the way, one of the advantages Wave Hill has, being in the middle of the city, is it has no deer, because I don't know about you if you've tried to grow trilliums, but deer love trilliums. Luckily, Wave Hill doesn't have to cope with that, although they do have to cope with rabbits, but they've got a fox who moved in recent years, and they're cheering on the fox. Shrubs are a big part of the Wave Hill. They extend and enhance the bloom. There on the left, you've got a late spring bloomer, Fothergilla gardenia, which sends a wonderful fragrance, perfume through the whole shade border. And on the right, one of my favorite native shrubs, oak leaf hydrangea, Hydrangea quercifolia, which has this great oak leaf foliage. And then in summertime, it gets these cones of white flowers, almost like ice cream cones. And then they gradually age as the summer wanes, they age to pink, hang on to the plant, and then in fall, the foliage turns bright red to purple. So it's a great plant for, oh goodness, 2 or 3 seasons. Ferns, of course, are a big number in the shade border. Here we've got a Japanese painted fern on the left, Ethereum nipponicum pictum, and a Polystichum fern on the right. They are great background and great textural plants. One of the things we don't talk about too much with shade is we tend to think of shade as moist, but in fact, a lot of shade is not moist at all. The tree roots, if the shade is underneath a shallow rooted tree, the tree roots suck all the water out of the ground, and you get what's called dry shade, which can be very challenging. And they don't have an irrigation system in the shade border. They can bring in sprinklers with hoses, but that's a lot of work, and they try not to do it. They didn't want to put in an irrigation system because the trees were already mature and they would have had to cut their roots to run in pipes for irrigation. So instead, where they're shallow rooted trees, they put in plants that do well in dry shade. And this is a example of two of the plants that do well in dry shade. On the left, you've got a wild geranium, Geranium phaeum, and on the right, you've got a corydalus, a squirrel corn. Both do very well in dry shade. They're not so often offered in nurseries, but I think if gardeners demand them, then maybe nurseries would, your better local garden centers might include some of these plants in their offerings. Here's rhododendrons. Native rhododendrons are a big part of the display. You've got a flame azalea on the left, rhododendron candyloceum, and a rhododendron, a pinkster rhododendron, rhododendron paracliminoides on the right. These are natives. So they have a lot of native plants in the shade border, but Wave Hill has not gone totally native. It's frankly cosmopolitan place, and they include a lot of cosmopolitan shrubs. Among other things, we share one of the interesting details that gardeners, good gardeners know, is that millions and millions and millions of years ago, North America was actually attached, northeastern North America was actually attached to Asia, and or North America was attached to Asia, and we share a flora with northeastern Asia, Korea, Japan, and northeastern China. So there are a lot of related plants, and a lot of those Asian plants do very well in our soils and our climates. And many of them, there's a greater diversity of plants in Asia. It's a bigger continent. And as a result, they're more summer bloomers. So you've got these summer bloomers, for instance, these two exotics, fairy bells on the left, Disperum cantoniensis and waxy bells on the right. Those are both summer bloomers. Waxy bells, the Latin name for that is Caringashoma. And then, of course, you've got the summer and into fall, where fruits play a big part of the display in Wave Hill in general, but especially in the shade border. You've got a viburnum on the left and a cotoneaster on the right. I think my favorite spot in Wave Hill is the Wild Garden, which is based on a book that was published in the late 19th century by an Irish gardener. His name was William Robinson, and he's called the Irishman who taught the English how to garden. The English were doing in Victorian times very kind of unimaginative what they call carpet bedding, geometrical patterns of annual flowers and a lot of island beds. It was very kind of tight and artificial and not very exciting, and a lot of work and a lot of money. Only the really wealthy could do it. And as the middle class started gardening in the latter half of the 19th century, they were looking for something that would be more in their budget. And also, I think they were maybe something that would be more of a beautiful scene rather than just a showplace for their wealth. So William Robinson wrote a book called The Wild Garden, which had a scheme for taking hardy plants from all over the world and combining them, perennial plants, and combining them together in something like a natural habitat, except that it was a natural habitat such as never has existed anywhere in the world because it'd been enriched from plants from all over the place. Well, Marco and John Nally did this on a slope at Wave Hill, a southwest facing slope. And they chose plants, mostly species type plants, wild type plants from foothills of mountains all around the world and combined them on this hill at Wave Hill. This is the beginning of first week of March at Wave Hill. You can see the snowdrops blooming as the snow is still on the ground. The gardens, as I said with the flower garden, they have to be good all the time, all through the season. You know, there's spectacular views at Wave Hill, but that can be a distraction. It could easily be that you stare at the view and pay no attention to the garden. So what they did in the Wild Garden is they start you at the bottom of the slope and have you climb up the slope away from the view, looking, and they with twisting paths and different trees and shrubs planted. And the trees and shrubs, a lot of them evergreen, sort of semi-dwarf evergreens, do two things. One is they help to screen the paths so you only get the view at calculated intervals where the path will make a turn and all of a sudden you'll be exposed to a view of the Hudson River. But they also create shade. They create so that there's a lot of different kind of conditions, different types of habitats to plant in. And this is, for instance, you can see here with the shifting light on the garden at the left and the carefully rationed views. As I said, mostly they planted species types in the wild garden, but they couldn't resist putting in a few cultivars too. On the left, you've got a wild type columbine, an Aquilegia canadensis. On the right, you've got a double flowering cultivar of it. On the left, another double flowering columbine. And on the right, you've got some allium, some ornamental onions. Wonderful shifting tapestries of color from mid to late spring and May through June in the wild garden. One of the things that they do that's very clever, and I'm trying to do more in my own garden, is work with volunteers. That's self-sown seedlings that come up around the garden. These have some advantages. You don't have to plant them yourself. They replant themselves every year, come up and bloom like these mulleins that you see on the left there, those big tall spikes. Those are actually biennials. They take 2 years to grow up to bloom. But then they sow seeds around the garden, and you can see at how the mulleins come up around the garden, serving as punctuation around the garden. One of the advantages of the volunteers is that the seeds that do well have found a spot that they really like. And they're better at choosing a spot they really like than gardeners are at figuring out where they want to be. So the volunteers often do better than planted plants. And then you can every year, of course, you get variation because every year what comes up is slightly different and in slightly different places. But design becomes a matter of editing. You have to keep, you can't let the volunteers just take over. So you go through and remove some and carefully leave them where you want them. So you get them as a sort of dynamic element through the garden, but you keep a balance and contrast interesting through the garden. The volunteers are especially important in the wild garden in early summer. You've got hollyhocks on the left, and on the right, you've got foxglove. Here's an example of using the different habitats that the dwarf evergreens produce. On the left, you've got the evergreens with a clematis montana growing up them. Clematis like to have their roots in the shade and cool. And so this is on the north side of the evergreen. It's perfect. It climbs up the dwarf evergreen and into the sun, but its roots are shaded and cool down below the evergreen. On the right, you've got a dry spot, a full sun on a hill. And they've often amended the soil. They'll dig grit into the soil so it drains faster in some of the beds and is good for plants that love dry conditions, like these foxtail lilies, these erythroniums you see on the right. One of the things they've managed to do is managed to make a lot of wild type bulbs grow perennial, which I've had, unfortunately, very little success with in my garden. You've got tulipa, a species type tulip on the left, Tulipa sylvestris, and a dogtooth violet from the Pacific Northwest on the right. This is October. And as I said, you climb up the hill, your eyes are away from the river, and you climb towards this pergola that's got this carefully controlled view they've pruned an old yew at the right of the pergola to just allow one view right out through the post. But when you get up there and turn around, you see this down below you, this marvelous sweeping view of the Hudson River. I'm going to switch to where the greenhouses were in the 1920s. These grew vegetables for the estate. They were not retained. They were demolished for For a while, they were used, Marco and John just used them for making compost in, but then saw them as an opportunity. They're on a south-facing slope, which is very sunny, very hot, and tends to be dry and well drained. So they created this trio of gardens there, an herb garden, a dry garden, and an alpine garden on the south-facing slope. You've got the herb garden on the bottom. And herbs, a lot of them are Mediterranean plants, a lot of our culinary herbs. It's not just great cooking that comes from France and the Mediterranean, France and Italy. It's also great culinary plants. So a lot of the herbs like a hot, dry summer. And with the winds from the river, the humidity stays down, and the drainage of these terraces is very good, so the herbs do particularly well. This is the next terrace up. This is a so-called dry garden. These are ornamental plants from Mediterranean climates from around the world. So not only from around the Mediterranean Sea, but also from California, from Southern California, and from Australia and New Zealand. Most of these are not supposed to be hardy in New York City. But what they did was they found that the real problem was not just winter cold, but it was the combination of winter cold and freezing around the roots, waterlogging and freezing ice around the roots. So they dug down 2 feet in these beds, mixed in a lot of compost, about half and half soil and compost, so that it would drain very well, and then topped the soil with 6 inches of fine gravel as a mulch. And these plants go down through the gravel into the well-drained soil, and they've got things winter hardy there that are definitely not supposed to be winter hardy in Zone 7, New York. Here's fall in the dry garden. Interestingly, there's a great comment on the climate of New York from T.H. Everett, who used to Marco told me T.H. used to tell him that New York was like Siberia in the winter, but Sumatra in the summer. Well, if you use your microclimates cleverly, you can moderate both those effects. And this is the top terrace. This is an alpine garden. These are all tiny little mountain plants and tiny little compact evergreens, all in troughs to make these miniature landscapes. The interesting thing about the troughs is that they're made of a concrete and peat mix. It's called hypertufa, and they water the troughs just about every day in the heat of the summer, and the water goes down through the soil and sweats out through the concrete at the sides of the trough, evaporates off the surface, and acts as evaporative cooling to keep the troughs cool, so the alpine plants do well even through the summer at Wave Hill. And then there's the alpine house. Again, very airy, but a beautiful place to display small high mountain plants and because of this microclimate of Wave Hill and this breezy atmosphere, they can get away with growing things that shouldn't be summer hardy in Wave Hill. That's one thing we don't talk enough about as gardeners, is summer hardiness. I gardened in Central Texas for 4 years, and there it was a big deal, summer hardiness. Plants that would survive the winter, most winters, often wouldn't survive the heat and humidity of the summer. So you're worried about summer hardiness. Well, it's something we really need to consider more up here. And there's the alpine house, a primula and a hepatica, liverwort, not a liverwort, excuse me, a hepatica acuta loba on the right. One of the great glories of the Wave Hill Garden are the annuals. They make the imaginative use of annuals is one of the trademarks of this garden. And it started, interestingly enough, because, well, like me, you know, going to the library because I was broke, Wave Hill had a tiny budget and was basically pretty broke when it got started out. And they couldn't afford to buy plants, started plants. They could only get seeds, often from seed exchanges, and grow plants from seed. So annuals were a big number because they produce quickly from seed. They also are a great enhancement to creativity because unlike perennials or shrubs, where it's a big investment for the plants that you buy and a long time for them to mature, so you invest a lot of time as well. Annuals are quick from seed and do their thing in the first summer, which means that you can take chances with them that you never would with perennials. Because if you do something really wild with perennials and it doesn't work out, you've wasted several years of work and maybe hundreds or thousands of dollars worth of plants. Whereas with annuals, if you don't like it, as one of my friends, I wrote a book on annuals with him, said, if you don't like it, just step on it and put something else in. Well, Wave Hill does a lot of very wild and imaginative things with annuals. This is one of the annual gardens. It's called the Paisley bed because it's shaped like a paisley. It's a survivor from the old estate days, but it's been planted every year. They come up with a different theme and plant different annuals. Interestingly, the first annual garden that they planted, Marco called the $16.30 garden because that's how much he'd spent on the seeds. By the second year, he said it could be called the $14.20 garden because a lot of the annuals had reseeded and they had volunteers coming out. And he said by the third year, they could have sold plants and turned a profit. One thing you'll see a lot in the Wave Hill is these tropical plants from the conservatory used for their foliage in the annual gardens. Here's a pergola overlooking the river, and it's mixing annuals again and conservatory plants summering out in the pergola where it's a little bit shaded. Things that can't tolerate the full sun are out there for the summer. If you go to Wave Hill, don't miss the cafe, which has great food, but it also has a wonderful display of potted plants. These again are largely annuals and tropicals moved out from the greenhouses. Instead of just displaying these as sculptural elements by themselves, they mass the pots together and create what amounts to beds and compositions where they play one plant off against the other. I said that Wave Hill is a very cosmopolitan place, but it does have its native plant garden. This is called the Elliptical Garden, and it's all native plants. It's on the site of an old swimming pool. So you can see where they paved over the swimming pool in the center and planted up around it in what would have been, I suppose, the sunbathing areas. This was in response to another query from visitors where they would ask to see what could be done with native plants. And Marco and Louis Bauer thought, well, you know, native plants are classically planted in naturalistic displays. People try to create sort of a surrogate woodland in their backyard, or maybe a meadow. But a lot of gardeners, particularly in suburbia, don't want to have a wild garden, a wild looking garden around their house. They want something more controlled and more formal. And they thought, what could we do in a formal display of native plants? Well, here's the answer. Very formal geometry, but all native plants. They also set out to prove something. One of the things about natives, one of the knocks on native that you hear a lot is that they're weedy. Well, that's not necessarily so. This is a native wisteria, Wisteria macrostachya called Blue Moon, which is much more modest grower than Chinese or Japanese wisterias. Well, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about the craftsmanship at Wave Hill, because one of the things about competing with the view is that the gardens have to look good every day. So one of the last chapters in the book we called The Edges of Everything. And this was largely Louis Bauer's chapter, talking about the craftsmanship of keeping everything just so at Wave Hill. For instance, staking. They're artists in the craft of staking. They do things with staking. At the left, they know when to stake early with the plants, so the plants grow up through the stakes so you can't see them. And it looks like the plants are just growing naturally, but they're actually carefully supported. On the right, you see what they've done with these. They collect most of the materials for the staking from the gardens themselves. And these are shoots from a shrubby dogwood made into hoops to tie plants up to as they come up. Pathways are kept swept. The spent foliage is removed. Everything has to be neat and tidy. Although not, and you can see at the left there, nice edging. The edges are kept carefully clipped. And one of the things that, I mean, this gives you an idea of the degree of craftsmanship, is they even select the mulches to suit the plant. On the right there, you can see a hellebore with purple flowers, Helleborus atrorubens, and the mulch underneath it, you can just barely see, are cinnamon colored white pine needles that are selected because they set off the hellebore. Hedges are meticulously trimmed and vines controlled. Pinching. A lot of the late bloomers, like the chrysanthemums, are pinched back regularly in early summer so that they become bushy plants, and it delays the bloom a bit to improve their fall bloom, and it also means that they need much less staking and support. But you can't be too fastidious, though, without kind of spoiling the effect. There's a kind of luxuriousness of, by season's end, the plants are allowed to spill over the edges of the past in abundance. One of the things about gardening is that it's often compared to painting as an art, but I don't think that's a good comparison, because gardening has 4 dimensions as an art. There are the 3 spatial dimensions, but then there's time too. Gardening, I think, is more like dance. It's a performance through time. So I thought I'd just take you for the end of the program, just take you through a season at Wave Hill. And here you've got Chianodoxa, blue flower, spilling down a woodland slope in early spring. The Chianodoxa is naturalized here and spread. Here's more Chianodoxa with daffodils underneath the dawn redwood in the entry garden at Wave Hill. Adonis had left, another spring flower, and a species tulip, Tulipa kaufmanniana, in the shade border and in the wild garden in spring. The first tree in bloom is usually Prunus holly jolivet, a cherry on the lower lawn. Soon there are tulips, of course, in the wild garden and along the back road. There's a great collection of magnolias, star magnolias, Magnolia stellata, and its hybrids on the entrance lawn. Those are later going to come later in the spring. Lilac time is spectacular by combining different cultivars and some species type lilacs. They get over a month of lilac bloom. In the summertime, color never takes a break. Here we've got dahlias and on the left a sunflower. And then as summer fades, the fall colors start. Here you've got the copper beech starting to show fall color. Fall colors in the garden. You know, we talk a lot about planting for fall color, but I think we too rarely do it. One of the, of course, great things about fall color is there's a Japanese technique that's called borrowing scenery, where you put something in your garden to suggest a connection to a distant scene, as if it was all planned as part of the same landscape. And here, Wave Hill is borrowing scenery with its colors borrowing scenery from the Palisade Cliffs across the river. Berries and seeds carry color on and into the winter. I've got an Idesia on the left and an American beautyberry, a Calicarpa americana on the right. The conifer collection comes into its own in wintertime, when the strong forms of the evergreens really take over and show to the best advantage, and the snow blanking out all the rest of the landscape. And the views change and expand as the leaves fall, adding an extra seasonal interest to the garden. Anyway, if you're interested, here's the cover of the book, Nature into Art, The Gardens of Wave Hill. I thought I'd also include this, just to note, I'm producing a podcast these days, and if you're interested, it's available for free. And here's the web address for it. You'll find it. It's called Growing Greener, and it talks about the environmental aspects of gardener. Each week I have a different expert on. I've had Doug Tallamy, and in fact, I guess the library here has shown some of the same people this year, which is fun. But if you want to get conversations with these experts, go to Growing Greener. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Oh my goodness, that is one breathtaking photo after the next. And I only regret that it isn't daylight and we can go out and take a walk in our own gardens and compare and contrast what we're doing versus what Marco Polo has done over at Wave Hill. I will say Wave Hill is open. As we discussed pre-presentation. It's open to the public Tuesday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 5:30, and you can take advantage of free admission all day on Thursday. So note that, Deb Smith, if I'm not here on a Thursday, you might find me down at Wave Hill. The one thing you have to do is make a reservation ahead of time because that's how they're monitoring the numbers of people who go in. But I wish in another era, pre-COVID or post-COVID, that the library would be able to organize a bus trip down there because it looks just amazing from the photos. I have a couple of questions. First, how many people work, how many gardeners are there at Wave Hill?
Surprisingly few, given that it's 28 acres. They do a lot with interns. They've got a big paid internship program, the John Nally internship program. But I think there's perhaps 8 or 10 gardeners full time. No
kidding. So in terms of organizing the work, is somebody a tree person, or do they divided the work up by the area, or do you know how they do that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It raises a good point, which is Marco Stufano insisted that everybody rotate and everybody collaborate in doing everything. So he created some very well-rounded gardeners like Louis Bauer, but Louis has allowed people to specialize in certain areas. So for instance, the wild garden now is the charge of one particular gardener. And the herb and dry garden, I think, are another gardener. And the annuals are handled by yet another gardener. So they do specialize at this point.
That's really interesting.
And they're allowed a lot of freedom in what they do in terms of changing and planting the garden.
Oh, that's even more interesting to know. There must be some discussion, I would think, about something before it happens, before they step on it and plant something else there.
Lunchtime gets very lively.
I'll bet. So 2 more questions, and I think they're quick. I was fascinated in the book when you have a section on pinching back, and I kept waiting in the text to see the words Chelsea chop. But it sounds like they don't actually chop. They're pinching by hand every one of those plants, which is why I asked about how many people are working there. Do you know about the Chelsea chop being used?
No, I don't know about the Chelsea chop. What is the Chelsea chop? Is that
well, that's where in June, you would take a plant that's going to be 6 feet tall, for instance, and you cut it back to about half in June so that it doesn't get quite so leggy, and you do delay the flowering a bit.
Ideally, with things like chrysanthemums, or for that matter, dahlias, you wait until they get about 6 inches tall and then pinch out the top bud and force out growth then the lower shoots come out and grow, and you pinch those back when they get taller, and you do it until about the 4th of July is a good time to stop, and then let it go. But you get much bushier plants. It delays bloom. So they don't do it to all of the dahlias, for instance. Some of the dahlias come out early, but they delay a lot of the dahlias that way. But it also makes the plants much stockier.
Yes, for sure. So Judy asked, has Wave Hill created a pollinator pathway? And if so, what plants did they use?
No, they haven't, and they should. That's a great idea. I'll forward that I'll start pestering Louis Bauer with that. They do a lot of environmental stuff. However, I have to say that they've got a woodland. Not all of the 28 acres are in gardens. And they've got about, I think, an 8-acre or 10-acre woodland. And they do a lot of environmental programs down there too. So they're very environmentally conscious.
Oh, that's wonderful. I was actually going to ask, in most of the photographs, it's a little hard to tell what the size of the spaces are, aside from the very long open lawn garden with the overlook over out to the Palisades. It looks like a lot of those gardens are not huge.
They're very intense. They're smallish, and it's one of the things that's nice about taking people, to use as an example, because they're small. It's not like, you know, Versailles, where you have to be a king with a regiment of gardeners. It's the individual spaces are small and intimate.
Yeah, it still feels residential, I would expect, except for some of the really huge spaces. So Sarah wants to know, how long did it take to develop the gardens?
Well, they're still developing, but it probably took a good, you know, Marco started with a tiny staff and no budget. And just, I think the flower garden was first, and then and the annuals, and then went to the wild garden, and gradually expanded as he had the staff and the funds. So it probably took 20, 30 years.
Wow, big investment. And the next question is, we all know, maybe have been to England and seen how they are putting pots of plants into the ground as though they're planted there, and substituting every couple of weeks for a fresh flower, so to speak. So Jim wants to know, do they add potted plants to keep it looking fully in bloom?
No, well, except for areas like the Cafe Terrace, where they're deliberately putting in potted plants. They bring plants out from their pots, tropical plants out from the conservatory, and take them out of their pots and plant them into the gardens in the summer. But for the most part, the succession of bloom is calculated, and it's mostly perennial.
Can you say, in terms of annuals to perennials, in not by the cafe, but, you know, is there it almost looked like there was a very small percentage of annuals in those garden beds.
Yeah, there's the volunteers. There's a lot of biennials and short-lived perennials that come up as volunteers. But typically, they have a couple of areas where they focus on annuals. But then, for the most part, it is perennials. A lot of them grown from seed. A lot of them, they got a lot of things. You know, one of the things is when they started out in the late 1960s, early 1970s, American horticulture was not very exciting at that time, and there were excuse me, it was hard to get unusual plants, and so they had to grow a lot of them themselves from seed.
Interesting. Okay, and I had one more question. You showed a beautiful picture of sort of a look down the Alpine house, and in the left-hand corner of that shot, there was a tree that looked like it might have been some kind of a cherry, a prunus in bloom. Do you remember what that tree? And then I thought maybe it's some kind of maple.
In the Alpine house, it's a threadleaf maple.
That's what I thought. Okay, it was gorgeous.
Not all of the plants, not all of the plants there are alpines. They build it as alpines and alpine compatible plants.
Oh, there you go. Okay, that makes perfect sense. I think I read through all of the questions in the chat. If anybody has any others, please go ahead and put them in. This may be your last opportunity. Tom, I wish we could just grab you by the hand and take you down to Wave Hill tomorrow and have you lead us around and tell us everything you know, because that would be such a marvelous tour. But I can guarantee everybody in the audience tonight, and if you see this later, that Tom's book, Nature into Art, is the best companion you could have if you're sitting at home in your armchair and you want to take a stroll through a garden. There's nothing better than Tom walking you through with his text and knock-nose photographs. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Tom, so much for your wonderful walk through Wave Hill for us in the middle of or towards the end of March. I can't thank you enough. And I do also urge you all to go listen to Growing Greener, because there is a ton to learn there that you don't often get anywhere else, actually. And there are some people that Tom is being very humble about, but you can't hear anywhere else. They just don't speak very frequently or in a place where you could listen to it for free. And if you didn't get that address, I will email it out to everybody for the Growing Greener login. And you can just go ahead and Google Growing Greener podcast, and that will get you the link to it too. Tom, I hope to hear much more from you in the future, and I hope there's a book in the writing as we speak.
Well, if you get that bus trip to Wave Hill together, let me know, because I'd love to join you.
I will do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Thank you too for showing up and sharing your Thursday evening with us. I hope to see you at another Essex Library program soon. Take care, everybody.